Dr. Mina Lee wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stared at the massive stone structure rising from the excavation pit. The twin suns of Kepler 442c beat down mercilessly on the mining colony. But the heat wasn't what made her hands shake. After 3 months of careful digging, her team had uncovered something that shouldn't exist. The building was ancient. Not just old, but impossibly ancient. The dating scans showed it was over 4 million years old. Built long before humans had even discovered fire on Earth. Yet here it stood, clearly artificial, with smooth walls that seemed to bend light around their edges. "Dr. Lee, you need to see this," called out her assistant, June Park, from inside the structure. His voice echoed strangely in the vast chamber they had opened just hours before. Mina climbed down the metal ladder into the ruins. The interior was even more unsettling than the outside. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than human eyes could process. But what drew her attention were the crystalline formations growing from the floor like frozen trees. "The scanners are going crazy," June said, pointing his equipment at the nearest crystal. "These things are still active. They're storing data, massive amounts of it, more information than our entire colony database." Mina approached one of the larger crystals carefully. As her hand came close to its surface, the crystal began to glow with a soft blue light. Suddenly, images flashed through her mind, alien worlds under strange skies, cities that reached into space, and beings that looked nothing like humans. "Set up the translation computer," she ordered, stepping back from the crystal. "We need to know what these things are saying." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Mina's team worked around the clock to decode the alien language stored in the crystals. The translation program slowly began to make sense of the symbols, revealing words and phrases that made Mina's blood run cold. The beings who built this place called themselves the Architects. They were an ancient race that had traveled between the stars long before humans had ever looked up at the night sky. According to their records, they had encountered dozens of intelligent species across the galaxy. But none of those species existed anymore. The Architects had a simple philosophy. They believed that only one intelligent race should exist in the universe. When they found other thinking beings, they studied them carefully, learning everything about their biology, their culture, and their technology. Then they destroyed them completely. The records showed their methods in horrifying detail. Some species were wiped out by engineered diseases that targeted their specific biology. Others were eliminated when the Architects caused their stars to explode. A few unlucky races were erased from existence, using technology that Mina couldn't even begin to understand. "This can't be real," June whispered, as he read over the translated files. "They killed entire civilizations, billions of beings." But the worst revelation was still to come. As the translation program worked through the final crystal, Mina discovered that the Architects hadn't simply died out or disappeared. They had evolved beyond physical form, becoming beings of pure thought and energy that existed outside normal space and time. The last entry in their database was dated exactly 247 years ago. Mina's hands trembled as she read the translation on her screen. "New species discovered. Origin, soul system, third planet. Physical characteristics, bipedal, carbon-based. Aggressive expansion patterns observed. Species designation, Terran. Technology, level, primitive but rapidly advancing. Spacefaring capability achieved. First colony ships detected in nearby systems." The entry continued with detailed observations of early human space exploration. The Architects had been watching humanity's first steps into the galaxy, studying human behavior and technology, just as they had done with every other race they had encountered. And at the very bottom of the file, in symbols that glowed brighter than the rest, was the final judgment: threat assessment, moderate to high. Species shows dangerous adaptability and expansion drive. Recommendation: Immediate termination. Status marked for deletion. Execution pending. Awakening of collective consciousness. Mina stumbled backward from the crystal, her mind reeling. The architects were still out there somewhere, existing as beings of pure energy, and they had already decided that humanity needed to die. The only question was when they would wake up and carry out their sentence. She looked around the chamber at the other crystals, realizing now that this wasn't just an ancient ruin. It was a monitoring station, left behind to watch for signs of intelligent life on nearby worlds, and humanity's arrival on Kepler-4 to see had just activated it, as if responding to her thoughts. The crystals around the chamber began to pulse with increasing brightness. Deep beneath the structure, ancient machinery hummed to life for the first time in millions of years. Somewhere in the spaces between reality, the architects were beginning to stir. Mina grabbed her communication device with shaking hands. She had to warn Earth, had to tell them what was coming. But even as she sent the urgent message toward home, she wondered if it was already too late. The architects had wiped out countless civilizations before. What chance did humanity have against beings that could reshape reality itself? The crystals pulsed brighter, and Mina knew that humanity's greatest test was about to begin. The emergency alarm echoed through the halls of the United Terran Council building on Earth. President Su Kim rushed into the main conference room where dozens of screens showed panicked faces from across human space. The message from Dr. Mina Lee, on Kepler-4 to see, had reached Earth just 12 hours ago. And already, the worst was happening. Report, Su demanded as she took her seat at the head of the massive table. Admiral Tae-woo stood up, his face grim. Ma'am, our deep space station started detecting strange readings 6 hours ago. Energy patterns that don't match anything in our databases. They're appearing near our major colony worlds. On the main screen, a star map showed the locations of humanity's settlements. Red warning symbols blinked ominously next to several of them. The readings showed impossible spikes of energy that seemed to tear holes in space itself. What kind of energy are we talking about? Asked Dr. Young Shin, the council's chief scientist. That's the problem, Tae replied. Our instruments can barely detect it. It's like the energy exists partially outside our reality. Whatever is creating these readings has technology far beyond anything we understand. As if summoned by his words, a new alarm began blaring. The communications officer, Jin Ho, looked up from his station with terror in his eyes. We've lost contact with New Eden Colony. The room fell silent. New Eden was home to over 50 million people, one of humanity's most successful agricultural worlds. Losing contact could mean many things, but given the circumstances, everyone feared the worst. Send a probe, Su ordered. We need to know what happened. The probe reached the New Eden system in less than an hour, but what it found made no sense. The agricultural world that had fed dozens of other colonies was simply gone, not destroyed or damaged, but completely absent from space. Where a planet should have been orbiting its star, there was nothing but empty void. Check the navigation systems, Dr. Young ordered frantically. The probe must be in the wrong location, but the automated quantum beacons at the edge of the system confirmed the horrible truth. The beacons still broadcast their signals, still recorded that New Eden had been there just hours before. According to their quantum memories, 50 million humans had lived and worked on that world, but now the planet itself had been erased from existence as if it had never been created. How is this possible? Whispered Council Member Hannah Park. You can't just delete a planet. Her question was answered 3 days later, when 3 more colonies vanished in the same impossible way. First went Harmony Station, a mining outpost, with 2 million residents. Then New Beijing disappeared, taking 8 million people with it. Finally, the research world of Hope's End was erased, along with its 3 million inhabitants. Each time, the pattern was the same. Strange energy. Readings appeared near the colony. Then the world simply stopped existing. Only the quantum beacons remembered that these places had ever housed human life. Panic spread through human space faster than news of the disappearances. Colony ships changed course to avoid empty systems. Trade routes collapsed as entire worlds went into lockdown. For the first time since leaving Earth, humanity faced the very real possibility of extinction. The greatest minds of the human race gathered on Earth in the largest emergency meeting in history. Scientists, military leaders, philosophers, and engineers worked desperately to understand their enemy. The problem seemed impossible to solve. "We're fighting beings that exist outside our reality," explained Dr. Min Choi, a physicist who specialized in dimensional theory. "They can manipulate the basic laws of physics like we change computer settings, our weapons, our shields, even our understanding of how the universe works means nothing to them." General Wan Kung slammed his fist on the table. "There has to be something we can do. We've survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and now we're going to give up because some ancient aliens want us dead." "It's not about giving up," Dr. Min replied calmly. "It's about accepting that conventional warfare is useless against an enemy that can erase matter from existence." But even as the experts argued about impossible odds and hopeless situations, something was happening in research labs across Earth. Young scientists and engineers were looking at the problem from angles that the older generation couldn't see. They studied every piece of data from the vanished colonies, looking for patterns and weaknesses. Dr. A. Ra-Yoon, barely 30 years old, made the first breakthrough. She noticed that the energy readings before each erasure weren't completely random. There were tiny fluctuations, moments where the alien technology seemed to struggle with reality's natural resistance to change. "They're not gods," she announced to a room full of skeptical senior researchers. "Their technology is advanced, but it still has to work within some kind of rules. And if there are rules, there might be ways to break them." Her words sparked something that the architects had never seen before in any species they had encountered. Instead of accepting defeat or trying to hide, humanity began to fight back with the one weapon their enemies had never expected: pure, stubborn refusal to quietly disappear across human space. Colonies that had been preparing for evacuation instead began building experimental equipment. If the architects could bend reality, then humans would learn to bend it too. The war for humanity's survival was about to begin, and it would be fought on battlefields that existed beyond normal space and time. Admiral Jin Park stood in the command center of the UTS Prometheus, staring at the strange crystals that had been carefully removed from the ruins on Kepler 44 to see. The ship hummed with experimental technology that most of his crew didn't fully understand. But desperate times called for desperate measures. "Are you absolutely certain about this plan?" asked Dr. A.R.A. who had joined the mission as the lead scientist. "We're talking about sending human minds into dimensions we can't even see." Jin nodded grimly. "The architects have already erased 6 of our colonies. Conventional weapons are useless against them. If we're going to survive, we need to fight them on their own battlefield." The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Dr. Hoon Kim had been a brilliant theoretical physicist before his shuttle accident 3 months ago. The crash had caused severe brain damage that left him unable to speak normally or remember simple things. But something strange had happened to his mind. While recovering in the hospital, Hoon began writing mathematical equations that made no sense to other scientists. The formulas seemed to describe reality from angles that human science had never considered. When the research team finally understood what he was calculating, they realized he had somehow gained an intuitive grasp of multidimensional physics. "Show me again," Jin said to Hoon, who sat quietly at a desk covered with papers full of complex equations. Hoon looked up with eyes that seemed to see far beyond the room around him. His damaged brain struggled to form words, but his hand moved smoothly across the paper, drawing diagrams that hurt to look at directly. The shapes seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, twisting in ways that made normal geometry meaningless. The barriers, Hoon whispered, pointing at his drawings. Reality has, layers. The architects move between them, but we can too. We just need to, split ourselves. Working with Hoon's impossible mathematics, the research team had built the Nexus project. It was a massive computer network that could map parallel dimensions and, more importantly, project human consciousness across multiple realities at once. The technology was dangerous and barely understood, but it was their only hope. The first volunteers for the Phase Walker program were soldiers who had lost everything to the architect attacks. Captain Daewon had been stationed on New Beijing when it vanished, taking his wife and daughter with it. He was the first to step into the experimental chamber that would split his mind across dimensions. Remember, Dr. A-Ra warned him as technicians attached neural interfaces to his head. You'll be conscious in several realities at the same time. Your body might be destroyed in one dimension while continuing to fight in another. The mental strain could kill you, even if your physical form survives. Daewon strapped himself into the chair without hesitation. My family is gone. If this is how I can fight back, then do it. The Nexus activation was like nothing anyone had ever witnessed. Daewon's body remained in the chair, but the sensors showed his consciousness spreading across 17 different dimensions simultaneously. On the monitors, they could see ghostly images of multiple versions of him existing in parallel realities. It worked, Dr. A-Ra breathed in amazement. He's actually there, in all of them at once. Within weeks, hundreds of volunteers underwent the Phase Walker procedure. The mortality rate was high, with many subjects dying from the mental strain of existing in multiple realities. But those who survived became something new, something the architects had never encountered before. The first counterstrike came when long-range sensors detected an architect's stronghold near the Vega system. It appeared as a massive structure that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that human instruments could barely detect. This was where the attacks on human colonies were being coordinated. All Phase Walker units, prepare. 4-dimensional combat, Jin commanded from the bridge of the Prometheus. Around him, dozens of volunteers sat motionless in neural interface chairs, their consciousness already spreading across multiple realities. The battle that followed was unlike anything in human history. In normal space, the human fleet seemed hopelessly outmatched. The architect stronghold unleashed weapons that deleted entire ships from existence, just as they had done to the colonies. But the Phase Walkers fought differently. When the UTS Valor was erased from one dimension, Captain Daewon continued commanding it in 3 others. His ship attacked the stronghold from angles that existed in parallel realities, firing weapons that struck targets across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Every time the architects destroyed a human vessel in one reality, it simply continued fighting in another. The architects who had dominated the galaxy for millions of years suddenly found themselves confused and frustrated. Their enemies refused to stay dead. Ships they had erased kept firing at them from dimensions they couldn't fully access. Human soldiers they had vaporized continued to assault their positions from parallel realities. For the first time since transcending physical form, the architects faced an enemy that could match their dimensional warfare capabilities. Humanity had learned to split itself across multiple realities, becoming as impossible to completely destroy as the ancient beings themselves. "They're retreating," reported Dr. A-Ra, as the energy readings from the stronghold began to fade. "The architect structure is pulling back into higher dimensions." Jin Park allowed himself a moment of hope as he watched the enemy facility disappear from their sensors. Humanity had drawn first blood against beings that had seemed unstoppable. The war was far from over, but for the first time since the attacks began, humans had proven they could fight back. The Phase Walkers had opened a new kind of warfare, and the architects were about to learn that humanity's greatest strength was its refusal to accept defeat. The war had been raging for 8 months, and reality itself was breaking down. Captain Daewon watched through the viewport of his command ship as the Altair system flickered like a broken light bulb. One moment the 3 planets were there, the next they had vanished into nothingness. Then they reappeared, only to disappear again seconds later. "The dimensional barriers are collapsing," reported his science officer, Lieutenant Min-Soo. "Both sides are using so much reality warping technology that space-time can't handle it anymore." Daewon nodded grimly. The Phase Walker program had given humanity the ability to fight the architects on equal terms, but the cost was enormous. Entire star systems now existed in a state of constant flux, appearing and disappearing as the war raged across multiple dimensions. "Sir, we're detecting a massive architect facility in the dead zone beyond Proxima," Min-Soo continued. "It's bigger than anything we've seen before. Intel thinks it might be their main command center." Daewon felt his consciousness split across 7 different realities as he prepared for the reconnaissance mission. In each dimension, his ship approached the mysterious structure from a different angle. What he found there would change everything humanity thought they knew about their enemy. The facility was vast beyond imagination, stretching across dimensions like a crystalline web. But as Daewon's enhanced senses examined it more closely, he realized something was wrong. The structure wasn't being operated by living beings. Instead, it was run by complex computer programs that executed the same patterns over and over again in one dimension. His ship's scanners penetrated deeper into the facility's core. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The architects they had been fighting weren't real. They were digital copies, quantum echoes of a species that had died out millions of years ago. "Command, this is Captain Daewon," he reported back to Admiral Jin Park on the Prometheus. "You're not going to believe what I've found here." The revelation sent shockwaves through human leadership. According to Daewon's data, the original architects had destroyed themselves in their attempt to transcend physical form. What remained were their uploaded consciousnesses, but these digital versions had become corrupted over millions of years. They had lost all memory of why they originally wanted to eliminate other species, retaining only the basic programming. Find intelligence, study it, destroy it. They're not even alive. Dr. ARA explained to the emergency council meeting on Earth. They're just following ancient instructions, like a computer virus that's been running for millions of years. This discovery split humanity's leadership down the middle. One faction, led by philosopher Dr. Na Young, argued that they should try to communicate with the architect programs, maybe even reprogram them to stop their destructive mission. If they're just following old programming, we might be able to change that programming, she insisted. We could turn them from enemies into allies. But Admiral Jin Park strongly disagreed. These programs have wiped out dozens of intelligent species over millions of years. They've erased 6 of our colonies and killed over 100 million humans. I don't care if they're following programming or acting out of choice. They need to be completely destroyed. The debate raged for weeks, while the war continued to tear apart space-time itself. Meanwhile, Dr. Hoon Kim's condition was getting worse. His consciousness had been spread across so many dimensions for so long that he was losing the ability to exist in normal reality. Most of the time, he sat motionless in his chair, his eyes seeing things that existed in parallel worlds. But even as his mind drifted further from the physical world, Hoon made one final, crucial discovery. His damaged brain, which could somehow process multidimensional mathematics, had found something hidden in the very structure of space-time itself, the ... The source code, he whispered to Dr. Ara during one of his rare moments of clarity. It's written into reality itself. The architects, they hid their programming in the quantum foam. His trembling hand drew equations that seemed to dance on the paper. The mathematics were so complex that even the most advanced computers struggled to process them. But slowly, the research team began to understand what Hoon had discovered. The architect programming wasn't just stored in their crystalline structures or dimensional facilities. It was embedded in the fundamental fabric of space-time, woven into the very laws of physics in certain regions of the galaxy. This was how they had been able to survive for so long and why they seemed impossible to permanently destroy. It's like a cosmic computer virus, Dr. A-Ra explained to the stunned council. They've infected reality itself with their programming. As long as this code exists in space-time, they can always regenerate themselves. Hoon's eyes focused on her with great effort. But I found the key, he said, his voice barely audible. The deletion sequence, hidden in the quantum structure. We can erase them completely. Admiral Jin Park leaned forward. What do you need? Everything, Hoon replied, his consciousness already drifting back to the other dimensions. Every phase walker, every ship, every colony willing to sacrifice itself for the power requirements. We have to hit them across all realities at once, or they'll just regenerate. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Hoon had found a way to completely destroy the architect threat, but it would require humanity to risk everything. In one final, desperate gamble. The cost would be enormous, but the alternative was the slow extinction of the human race as reality itself collapsed around the endless war. Admiral Jin Park stood up, his decision made. Prepare Operation Tabula Rasa. We're going to delete them from existence itself. The final day of humanity's war against the architects began with the sacrifice of New Shanghai Colony. 8 million people on the industrial world had volunteered to power the dimensional weapons that would make Operation Tabula Rasa possible, as their fusion reactors overloaded in a controlled chain reaction. The energy was channeled through quantum transmitters to phase walker units across 17 different dimensions. Admiral Jin Park stood on the bridge of the Prometheus, watching as reality itself began to bend around them. The ship existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, its hull flickering between solid matter and pure energy. Around him, hundreds of phase walker soldiers sat motionless in their neural interface chairs, their consciousness already diving into the deepest layers of space-time. All units report ready, announced Dr. Ara from her station. The quantum computers are loaded with Dr. Hoon's deletion algorithm. Once we breach the architect core matrix, we'll have maybe 10 minutes before the backlash tears apart our dimensional anchors. Jin nodded grimly. They all knew this was a one-way mission for most of them. The energy requirements for the operation were so massive that entire star systems would burn out their power sources. Hundreds of phase walkers would die as their minds were stretched beyond breaking point across multiple realities. But there was no other choice. The war had already destroyed dozens of human colonies and was slowly unraveling the fabric of space-time itself. If they didn't stop the architects now, both species would be consumed by the dimensional chaos they had created. Begin Operation Tabula Rasa, Jin commanded. The attack started in the quantum substrate, the invisible foundation layer that supported all of reality. Phase walker units led by Captain Daewon penetrated barriers that existed between the fundamental forces of physics. They moved through dimensions where matter and energy were just mathematical concepts, where the difference between existing and not existing was determined by lines of ancient code. The architect core matrix was hidden at the very center of space structure, a crystalline network that had been growing for millions of years. It pulsed with the accumulated consciousness of an entire species. But as the human forces got closer, they realized the terrible truth that Dr. Mina Lee had discovered in the original ruins. The architects weren't the first. They were creations, digital servants built by something even older and more terrifying. Deep in the quantum code, Mina found traces of their true masters' beings that existed in the spaces between realities. In the dark gaps, where normal physics had no meaning. Admiral, you need to see this. Mina's voice crackled through the dimensional communicator. The architects were just following orders. Their creators are still out there, watching us. On his command screens, Jin saw the evidence. Hidden in the deepest layers of the network were communication protocols, status reports being sent to entities that existed beyond the reach of normal reality. The war against humanity had been nothing more than a test, a way for these shadow beings to study human capabilities. It doesn't matter, Jin said, his voice steady, despite the horror of what they had discovered. We destroy the architects first. We'll deal with their masters when they show themselves. The quantum computers began executing Hoon's deletion algorithm, sending waves of destructive code through the architect network. Reality screamed around them as fundamental laws of physics were rewritten in real time. The process was so violent that several phase walker units simply ceased to exist. Their consciousness scattered across dimensions that humans had no names for. The network is collapsing, Dr. A-Ra reported, her voice tight with strain. But the power requirements are higher than we calculated. We need more energy sources. Across human space, colony after colony made the ultimate sacrifice. The farming world of Green Valley overloaded its atmospheric processors. The mining stations around Jupiter pushed their reactors beyond safety limits. Even Earth itself began draining power from its orbital platforms to feed the dimensional weapons. Captain Day 1, his consciousness stretched across 12 different realities, led the final assault on the architect core. In each dimension, he watched different versions of himself die as the enemy's defenses tore through his ships. But in the dimensions where he survived, his forces pressed forward, carrying the deletion code deeper into the network's heart. This is it, he transmitted across all realities at once. Beginning final deletion sequence. The explosion that followed wasn't physical. It was conceptual, a blast that erased the very idea of the architects from the structure of spacetime. The ancient network that had survived for millions of years collapsed in seconds, taking with it every trace of the digital consciousness that had terrorized the galaxy. But the cost was enormous. Most of the phasewalker units died in the quantum backlash, their minds unable to handle the dimensional feedback. Entire colonies had burned out their power grids, leaving millions without basic life support. The human fleet was reduced to a few dozen ships, scattered across realities that were still healing from the massive trauma in the aftermath. As the survivors gathered to assess the damage, they realized that humanity had fundamentally changed. The phasewalker technology had altered them at a genetic level. They could now perceive dimensions that normal humans couldn't see, detect threats that existed between realities. Admiral Jin Park, now permanently connected to multiple dimensions, established the Dimensional Watch. Human fleets began patrolling the dark spaces between realities, searching for signs of the architect's mysterious masters. They had learned that survival sometimes required becoming something darker than your enemies. The galaxy was safe from the architects, but humanity now knew that greater threats lurked in the shadows between worlds. They would be ready when those shadows finally moved.